Hello, Texas Value supporters. My name is Mary Elizabeth Castle, and I'm the Director of Government Relations for Texas Values. Thank you so much for joining us today before the 4th of July. For those of you who listen to this on the radio, it'll be the weekend afterwards. Hoping you're enjoying your summer with your family, having fun. If you're in the Austin area, maybe going to Lake Austin or somewhere else fun to enjoy the holiday, but also celebrate freedom, which is what it's all about this weekend. And we at Texas Values, of course, value freedom. We value faith and family as well. And so we have a really great show today to talk about faith and family. We have Sarah Parshall Perry from the Heritage Foundation. Now, Sarah Parshall Perry is a senior legal fellow at the Edwin Meese, the Third Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. We're so happy to have someone talk about some of the great things that are happening to stop gender modification and some of the troubling things that are happening at the Biden administration. Sarah, thank you so much for joining our show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Mary.
Absolutely. So I'll tell our supporters a little bit about your background. So you're the senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, but before that, your focus has always been on civil rights, constitutional governance, regulatory policy, the proper role of courts. You made several media appearances. And also notably, you were the senior counsel to the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, which means you really know what you're talking about when you're critiquing the Biden administration. So we're so happy to have you. And I want to cover several topics on the show today because you have a wide span of what you do at the Heritage Foundation when it relates to gender issues, the Title IX issue. You've even worked on some life issues as well. But I want to take our listeners back a little bit. So we've been talking a lot about the Title IX rewrite. A lot of people are like, how did this come out of nowhere? Only the Biden administration could think of this. But let's go back because it has been a step-by-step process, and it has been something that's been, kind of prepped for some time. So can you talk to our listeners about how the gender ideology even began in our schools?
Yeah, so this actually started with the first executive order under this administration. The president on January 20th, 2021, one of his first official acts as president was to tell every one of the federal executive agencies to take all of their rules and all of their laws that address sex discrimination and expand that to include gender identity discrimination. Well, we know sex and gender identity are two very distinct things, but what he relied on was a case called Bostock versus Clayton County. Now, Clayton County was an employment decision case specifically related to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And the court there said, listen, sex means male and female, but we're going to go a step further and we're going to look at attitudes and behaviors. And how the court reached its rationale, sort of a circuitous route that I, as a legal scholar, would take issue with, but nonetheless, it's what the court came up with, was to rely on, for example, the behaviors of a man versus the behaviors of a woman if they were the same. A woman who dresses like a woman is fine. A woman who dresses like, or a man who dresses like a woman, if that individual is fired, can sue for discrimination. So that's how the court reached its decision. It actually said specifically, we're not addressing anything outside this particular employment discrimination context. We're talking about hiring and firing. We are only talking about Title VII, and we are not addressing bathrooms, pronouns, dress codes, or anything of the like. And those were the exact words. But that didn't prevent the Biden administration from taking that particular holding and going, well, this now provides us basically cover to do everything we want in the federal government. So he instructed all of his executive agencies to take that sex prohibition and expand it to gender identity discrimination prohibition. And that affects everything, Mary, as you know, from HHS to DOJ to HUD to Department of Education. Every one of the federal agencies all enforce about 100 federal laws and federal regulations addressing sex discrimination. So we saw it essentially from the top down. This was kind of bubbling culturally for a while, but it certainly didn't have the cover of the federal government providing billions of dollars in funding to these particular education institutions or to the hospitals. But it definitely, I think, ramped up to a significant degree after Biden took the White House and issued that executive order after the Bostock decision.
Yes, I really like how you brought up the Bostock decision because that really was the genesis of a lot of problems, even though it was clear in the opinion that they didn't want it to cause all of these problems, or did they? And that's the question I had next.
Yeah.
Even when you think about the beginning of the, you could say, gay rights movement or LGBT movement, there was always this kind of sentiment that they said it's just about people wanting to get married or loving who they love. But how do we get to this point where the movement and even how Bostock, how did we get to this point that it was applied to schools and to education?
So that's sort of a follow the bouncing ball analysis, right? So you get the executive order, all the federal agencies get the directives, and then by the time it rolls around to the Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights there, where I worked, issued what's called informal guidance. And informal guidance is a way of letting all of the recipients of the federal funding that you disseminate know that you're going to enforce the law a particular way. And they said, we are relying on Bostock versus Clayton County. And now we will interpret Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, a more than 50-year-old civil rights law, to expand the definition of sex discrimination to include gender identity discrimination. Well, Title IX is the only federal law in our canon of civil rights laws that is specifically related only to sex discrimination. Just about all the others relate to other classes, right? Race, religion, national origin, ethnicity. This, however, is sort of the brass ring for the women's liberation movement. Remember, at the sort of like turn of the post-sexual revolution, late 60s, turning the corner into the early 70s, they really were unsuccessful in passing the Equal Rights Amendment, but they did get Title IX. Title IX has benefited for generations of women now who've gotten a chance to do everything from play collegiate athletics to go to graduate schools like me, to get their own housing facilities and scholarship opportunities. It really has leveled the educational playing field, and education sets everyone up for success later in life. We know it is really that fundamental stepping stone that really provides a foundation for the rest of one's career in life. So to affect that law changes, of course, the way we have been doing things now for 54 years. Women have women's colleges, women have women's athletics. There are female only scholarships. They are now female only private spaces, bathrooms, locker rooms, dorm rooms, all of those now under this particular administration, with the sort of signaling at the informal guidance stage, and ultimately after 2 years, the final rule we just saw published this past April. That is a complete upending of what Congress intended with Title IX of the Education Amendments. In fact, on the floor, Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, who was one of the primary Senate sponsors of the bill, said explicitly, listen, we've all been told women are good for nothing than being pretty little girls. And what these women really want to do is advance in career. We want to provide them an opportunity to get the education that they want. So he sort of nodded to the fact that women's opportunities and their equality was diminished until Title IX was passed. Now we're seeing sort of the discrimination of old being new again. So we've got women who are now having to share spaces, opportunities, athletics, and scholarships with biological men who identify as women. And that brings us kind of to where we are today.
Yeah, I appreciate you brought up that history of where Title IX came from and so many opportunities that come from that rule. A lot of people associate Title IX with sports and they may think, oh, well, since there's a football team, we have a softball team. But there's so many implications of this rewrite that I think a lot of people don't realize. Even Alliance Defending Freedom and other parental rights groups have talked about the parental rights threats from this new rewrite. Can you go into detail into some of the things that this new rewrite would do if it were to go in effect or if a school would have it in place?
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about sort of the diminution of women's opportunities and how it fundamentally changes women's education. But there's also an implication for the First Amendment. And here's why, because the rules themselves and the comments talk about the fact that if you misgender an individual, if even if your religious convictions prevent you from using an individual's preferred pronouns or a different name because you're convicted that the Bible tells you not to lie and you don't want to entertain what you believe is a fallacy, you could be hit with a Title IX sex harassment complaint. And Catherine Lehman, who's the Secretary for Civil Rights there, made that very clear. I was sitting in a closed door stakeholder meeting with her, and she made very clear in response to a direct question, if you misgender someone, yes, that can platform a Title IX complaint. So major
Wow.
First Amendment concerns, right? That's something I think a lot of people miss is now you don't get to say anything that is in accordance with your beliefs. You have to say essentially things that align to the government's sexual orthodoxy. That's one. There's a massive parents' rights implication here. And that's not obvious to everyone, but there are more than 11 million children in schools across the country, represented by about 1,100 school districts and school boards that are attending schools that have mandatory confidentiality policies. In gender support plans, every one of these schools has a provision that says we can keep this information about a child's gender identity completely separate and completely private from that minor child's custodial parents. Well, I have three teenagers. I have a 15, 17, and almost 20-year-old. And let me tell you, if that had been in place when they were in school, I would have been railing. So we're seeing now, we've seen at least 14 federal lawsuits all across the country, and one of which has gone up to the Supreme Court. It is currently pending on a petition for review for the next term at the Supreme Court.
That's amazing. Sometimes these things happen, even with the Obama Dear Colleague letter, that was kind of the warning shot for these type of policies. But sometimes these things can go under the radar, and it's sometimes a struggle to get people to speak out. But that hasn't been the case this time. We've had so many different, whether it's school districts or whether it's attorneys general in different states speaking out and filing lawsuits against this rewrite. Can you talk about which states have pending lawsuits and which school districts have pending lawsuits and kind of where they are in that process?
So the final rule was published in April, and within 4 weeks, we saw 9 federal lawsuits, which is a pretty substantial response, I would say, all across the country. And these are not all in red states. Some of them are in blue states as well. We've seen states file on their own behalf and on behalf of their citizens. We've seen superintendents of school file. We've seen individual plaintiffs file. We've seen a school board file. And we've seen not only superintendents of schools, but membership organizations and groups of individual minors. We've seen parents sue on behalf of minor children. It really runs the gamut. There are probably close to, at this point, 65 plaintiffs all across the country who have sued. 25 states are now involved in active litigation. So that's half the country. That is really significant. Of those 9 federal lawsuits, we've already seen victory in 5 of them. 2 particular federal court cases have enjoined the informal guidance. That's what came out in 2022. That was this is how we're going to interpret Title IX. Now, the reason that's important is because informal guidance forms the basis of a formal rule. So many of these, I think, were questioned. The people who are kind of outside the legal system and not following the litigation are going, well, what's the point? Why wouldn't you go after the final rule? But honestly, I think this is sort of a comprehensive litigation strategy. You're going to get the rule from start to finish, from the notice of interpretation to the informal guidance, all the way through to the formal rule. And all of these together, I think, are really yielding some good results. So 2 federal court decisions have come out ruling against the federal interpretive guidance. That's, again, the informal guidance. And then we've just seen 3 come out, and those are specifically on the formal rule itself, meaning in 14 states, The final rule, for all intents and purposes, is dead on arrival until another federal court reverses it or the Supreme Court takes it up.
Wow, that's amazing. I appreciate your explanation too of the injunction on the informal rule too. That's what recently happened in Texas with the Attorney General Kim Paxton first, victory over this. It was against the informal rule from that federal court with Judge Reed O'Connor. So a lot of people were trying to figure out, okay, well, does this matter? We still have to go over the formal rule, but I appreciate that you say that. That's really important that we still had that beginning victory.
Yeah.
And we're hoping for more victories to come. We've been talking about what happened in Carroll ISD. Now, they're a school district in Southlake, Texas, which is kind of in the northwest part of Texas. They took on the Biden administration, suing them because Carroll ISD is a school district that's really unique. They actually have solid policies that say you have to use a bathroom on your respective sex. You have to participate on the sports team according to your sex at birth, which is according to our Texas law. And so Carroll ISD said, you're going to make us violate our own policies, violate the values of our community. And that's going to cost us a lot of money, not only just going against what we believe, but we'll spend a lot of money rewriting policy, implementing this policy. So we were really excited to help them out. Alliance Defending Freedom is their attorney for this case, but we were able to help them get a lot of community attention around this issue. They had probably 90% of testifiers at their last board meeting last Monday saying that they're in support of this lawsuit. You had women saying, I'm a product of Title IX, or I was alive when Title IX was passed. And they said it would just be a tragedy to see some of these rights taken away. So we're really excited about this happening in Texas and hoping soon that we get some sort of decision on this case. But, a lot of people in Texas are starting to feel that pressure and disappointment. We held the line in our state with passing good policy. We're still trying to pass policy on the privacy issue and the restroom issue, but this rewrite has such a broad effect. And so it really affects everyone. Really important to pay attention at the national level of what's happening. With all these lawsuits, I mean, we have half the country suing the Biden administration, which is really strong. Like you said, it's not just the red states, not just Texas or Florida, but half of the United States is saying this is ridiculous. And that's really good news. But today's July 3rd, and we have until August 1st until the rule is supposed to go into place. So, what can we do until now, and can we stop this law from going into place?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the 14 states, they've gotten a reprieve, right? So all of those 14 states, now it's technically more than 14 states and more schools than the ones that are involved. And here's why, because in the recent decision that just came out of the Northern District of Kansas, and that litigation with 4 states, including the membership organizations of Young America Foundation and Moms for Liberty. One of the portions of the injunction from that judge says all of the students in schools where their mother or their parent is a member of Moms for Liberty, those schools are prevented from enforcing this Title IX rule. Now, let me tell you, I know the litigants here, they're in a bit of a scramble because now before July 15th, they have to essentially determine what membership organizations are represented with kids in what school, come up with a list and then produce it to opposing counsel. But you know what? That is actually a good sign that we're going to see this relief broaden and not constrict. And as this continues to move forward, the way that we've been kind of encouraging superintendents and local education associations and even principals of schools, do not enforce the Title IX rule. And here's why. Part of the reason is because these are all state agencies. State agencies they're essentially arms of the state. And in states where there are contrary policies, the Supreme Court has made very clear that when a federal regulation comes up against a state law, we don't want to divest the state from the democratic opportunity, right? The democratic process. You've enacted these laws, whether it's parents' rights laws or First Amendment protections or women's sports laws or definitions of biological sex. Everywhere there's a clash. The Supreme Court has said when it's in the state authority to do so, we got to leave these laws alone. They just reinforced that in Gorsuch's concurrence in a denial of stay in a case called Idaho versus Poe. That was over a gender medicine ban coming out of the state of Idaho. And while they dismissed it, I thought his opinion was very interesting because he reiterated again, for 100 years, we've protected the rights of states to enact these laws. So we've advised people, do not begin opening the state checkbook and spending money on something that may never see the light of day before the end of this year. Because as soon as the Supreme Court takes this up on a petition for review, and I would bet you dollars to donuts, that's exactly what's going to happen because they don't have a choice. Half the country is now embroiled in litigation, and they've just overturned, Mary, as you know, a very important legally created, judicially created doctrine known as Chevron deference in a case called Loper Bright Enterprises. Chevron deference gave all of the ambiguity in any federal statute to the federal agency and said, you can interpret this how you want because these are the laws that you enforce. So we're just going to give you the opportunity to say what you want. Well, the Biden administration relied heavily on Chevron deference in creating a rule because you and I and the drafters of Title IX, the Supreme Court justices, and every federal judge who is looking at this law realizes sex means male and female. Sex and gender identity are not the same. And I think this is something that should give people a lot of hope, but we've advised people just to hold the line. Litigation is ongoing. It is moving so fast. We have 2 more opinions we're waiting on because 3 emergency injunction hearings have already been held. We just got the first opinion yesterday out of the District of Kansas. We have 2 more that we're waiting on that I would not be surprised come out before August. This is going to be an expansion of the scope of relief as opposed to contraction. So I would tell these states, these principals, the school board members, it is moving so fast. We want to be good stewards of state resources. We don't want to open up the checkbook to a $3 million bathroom overhaul and insurance for personal injury lawsuits because now we've got boys and girls competing on the same sports teams. I think it's best at this point to just, and it's, I think, uncomfortable for a lot of people to hear who are waiting for that perfect clarification. Listen, we've got a lot of clarification already from 5 federal courts. We've said the same thing. This rule is illegal. The guidance is illegal. So that's half the country at this point that's weighed in. So I think at this point, it's best to say, keep your chin up, keep following the litigation, keep reading the opinions, and arm yourself with the facts to be able to take into your school board meeting or to your superintendent or to your principal and say, look at the extent of federal litigation. We don't want our school wrapped up in another lawsuit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been a great discussion. I did want to ask one more question. So we have a good group of interns this summer at Texas Values, and they wanted to, chip in and ask a question during the radio show. And I think we only have time for one more question. So our intern Shiloh, who actually testified against a bathroom policy when she was younger, wanted to ask you this question. And she wanted to ask, how do you think the feminist movement is affected by gender ideology? And how does gender ideology attack liberal feminist idea of equality and justice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the feminists of old that we saw push for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment and Title IX, right? Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan. These are women whose sort of philosophies and sort of modus operandi have gone completely silent. We're not seeing the feminists, the traditional feminists, speak out on this particular issue. There are some one-off organizations, the Women's Liberation Front, for example, and there's the Coalition for International Rights of the Women. These are smaller organizations, but the bulk of what we're seeing right now, the pushback, is coming from conservatives. Now, we've benefited from what was essentially a piece of legislation enacted that conservatives were really worried about to start with. but it has provided this basis for advancement for women, including myself, who was able to go to graduate school, for my daughter, who is now going to college on a volleyball scholarship. I mean, these are opportunities we wouldn't have except for Title IX. But we have all of this. We have this struggle because of the post-sexual revolution. The minute that we started to redefine the roles of men and women, and we started to eliminate what we understood to be the firm foundation, the creation of sort of that foundational Western civilization piece, which is the nuclear family. The minute we started attacking it, it was time essentially for everything else to fall along with it. And that's what we've seen. The gender identity sort of juggernaut is a direct result of the fact that we began to question God's perfect design, who male and female are, what male and female are, and even now the nature of biology itself.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for joining us on our show. We're at the end of time, but we appreciate you coming on our show, being our guest, and sharing so much information about the Title IX issues. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
All right, that's it for our Texas Values Report. Just want to thank you if you donated over the weekend for our end of fiscal year fundraising. We really appreciate your donations. We've had so many victories at the Texas Supreme Court last week, and other victories on Texas A&M stopping their gender program as well. Until next time, this has been the Texas Values Report with Mary Elizabeth Castle. Thank you so much, and tune in next week.